Dr. Julie Beischel joins us this portion of our program. Julie is Director of Research at the Woodbridge Institute, and she has spent over a decade studying psychic mediums who, in particular, experience communication with the dead. Her Kindle book, Among Mediums, presents research investigating the accuracy and specificity of information reported by mediums, unique aspects of mediums' experiences, psychology and physiology, and potentially the useful social applications of mediumship, readings in fields including bereavement, end-of-life care, and forensics. I thought her work was fascinating, and while I think this is the first Spindle ebook I've ever done on radio, I'm glad it's a first in something that means so much to me, which is the continuation of consciousness from life to death and life again. Thank you for joining us, Julie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. It's a fascinating study that you've done, and I know your PhD background's a little different than this. So why don't you share with our audience how you got involved in this most unusual work?
Okay. My bachelor's degree is in environmental sciences, and then my PhD is in pharmacology and toxicology with a minor in microbiology and immunology. So no, not a direct correlation at all. And I talk extensively about, I tell this story pretty extensively in my book Among Mediums, but the short version is when I was in graduate school, my mom committed suicide, and a few years later, after I'd gone through sort of my natural process of grief, the television show Crossing Over with John Edward was really big, and that was really the first time I'd ever heard of what a medium was, and the people on the show looked very moved by what he was saying, and it was very specific information. And so as a scientist, I wanted to check it out for myself. So I had a reading with a local medium, and it was very evidential. And I thought, well, wow, there's something to this. Something is going on here. And I brought my experience back. You know, I said I was in graduate school, and I told the other students and some of my professors about this experience. And as good scientists, most of them said, oh, I don't really know anything about that, but that sounds like a very interesting experience. And they just went on with their day. But a couple people said, no, those people are all frauds, and you were taken, and they used cold reading, and I was like, no, I was there. I was there. That's not how it happened. And so I have a very strong sense of justice, and I thought that was terribly unfair that there were these group of people who have these spontaneous experiences and are good at it and use it to help people, and there were these other people who were disparaging them and dismissing them as all con artists based on assumptions and no data. And so I thought a scientist needs to look at this specifically and to, really get to the bottom of this. And I looked into it, and there hadn't been a lot of research. Scientists have been looking into mediumship since the 1880s, but not a lot had been done relatively recently. So I thought, well, here is my path laid right out for me, and that this is what I'll be doing with my life, I guess.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's a fascinating turn from sort of being a clinical scientist of all the way down to the little molecules of things that happen in biology, to being exposed to using our faculty of consciousness that's outside time and space, and then deciding to document how, in fact, this happens. I think it's wonderful. I mean, your personal story is dramatic, and the fact that you've now created the Woodbridge Institute, and that's how I found you, was a link of something I was looking at, and then it linked to Woodbridge Institute, and that's how I found you. So now you write that in terms of mediumship, particularly in speaking with those who are no longer incarnate, I don't like to call them the dead. I just never have felt comfortable with calling people dead because they're not dead. They just don't have bodies.
Right.
So I'd like to say mediumship with people without their bodies on.
Yeah. Or I say the physically challenged, right? You don't have a body. Yeah. No, the scientific term we use is discarnate, which means not in the flesh.
Okay. The discarnate. So, yeah, I like that. You write that there are several theories of what is taking place. And I wanted to start there with these three different theories about what's happening.
Okay. So we have collected evidence that demonstrates that certain mediums can, in fact, provide accurate and specific information about discarnates when all normal explanations for where they might be getting their information are controlled for. So we've eliminated fraud, and we've eliminated information so general it could apply to anyone, and we've eliminated sensory feedback and cueing and all those sorts of things. And when you eliminate all those things, they still are providing this accurate and specific information. So the next question is, where is that information coming from? Because we can't just conclude, yes, they're talking to, pardon my use of the term, the dead. So there are three major theories. So basically, you can just think of it as two. We'll just talk about it sort of higher levels, two different things. So one, mediums are using their psychic ability to communicate with the deceased, or two, they're using their psychic ability to get the information about the deceased from the living, or from the future, or clairvoyantly from your grandmother's attic, or something like that. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard to differentiate between the two because they're both using right. They're not hearing the deceased talk.
Right, so it's kind of like a psychic reservoir, as I think you stated in your book. It's,
right, that's one of the theories, right, is the psychic reservoir. So they're getting their information potentially from like the Akashic field, or all the information is stored somewhere, and they're just accessing that store of information.
Which I want to add, and any medium will tell everybody else, anybody can learn to do, and some mediums are just naturally gifted and it's already developed, but many practice for years in order to develop this muscle, if you will, of hearing outside the bounds of physical ears, or seeing outside the physical eyes. So one is then the psychic reservoir.
Right. And you know, that's included with that. So there's it's sort of all grouped. The theory is sometimes called super psi. Mm-hmm. So it's the use of psi, PSI, psi abilities to get information from that psychic reservoir from the living, right? Mm-hmm. From the sitter, the living person wanting to hear from the discarnate. So they have information about the discarnate. So is the medium just reading it from them, mm-hmm. or are they reading it into the future or clairvoyantly from distant places? So they're using some form of psi with the living, mm-hmm. Or they're using some form of psi where they're communicating with the deceased, with the continued souls of or spirits, or however you want to think of it, with the deceased, right? Because they're not seeing them with their eyes, they're not hearing them with their ears. It's happening mentally, using some sort of psi ability, and so it's for 100 years there's been this debate, and so it's difficult to talk about, right? Because for a while it was called the super psi versus survival debate, but then, well, even if they are talking to the dead, then that also is using psi. So then it was like the super psi versus psi. So then we coined this term survival psi to explain how they're using psi to talk to the deceased. So that's the two things are sort of.
Right. And so when you started looking at this, I know that you asked the mediums themselves a very particular set of questions, meaning you had a standard set of questions, a protocol, if you will, with the mediums in order to kind of start discerning how each does what they do. So talk to us about your protocol.
Let me back up one second because I just misspoke. So
okay.
I just want to clear that up.
Please.
So I said we coined the term survival psi. That's not true. We coined this term somatic psi, which is that they're using, that they're getting their information from the living, versus survival psi, which means they're getting their information from the dead. So
okay.
the two theories are survival psi and somatic psi. So we'll move on from there.
All right.
So the protocol that we use is not to test. I think what you're talking about is our quintuple blind protocol.
Right. And
that is a protocol that's used to eliminate all the normal explanations for where they're getting their information, but it doesn't help us determine the source of the information. Mm-hmm. So we have to go in a different direction. So we've done a number of studies where we try to get to the bottom of this source of information question by studying the medium's what's called phenomenology, so right. their experience of the acquisition of the two types of information. Because if you just ask them, they know what somatic psi, what psychic information from the living feels like, and right. this what they experience as communication with the dead feels different to them.
I would agree with that, given that I've done that kind of work since I was a child. I didn't train. It's just when I get in the bathtub, there they are. They all start talking like it's Grand Central. So one of the things that you studied was this anomalous information reception that mediums have. And this is sort of something, I guess, a way that you've added to this discussion of where is this information coming from and how do they get it?
Well, that term, anomalous information reception, is just the term that we use to describe that they're getting specific and accurate information about the disease. It's called anomalous because we don't know where it's coming from. So the data that demonstrate anomalous information reception cannot differentiate between the source of the information. So we just say anomalous. It's coming from somewhere, and we don't know where it's coming from.
Right.
So it's a different sort of research program that investigates the source of the information, and that's this phenomenology research where we are investigating their experiences. So we've published one paper which was qualitative, where we just had them describe in as much detail. We just emailed them questions. Describe in as much detail your experiences when communicating with the deceased, and describe your experiences when accessing psychic information about the living. And it was a week apart, the questions were, and they were all counterbalanced, and it was all controlled. And so we published that paper, and there were, of course, some similarities because it's still the acquisition of non-local information, but there were some differences. And so recently we did a study, and I just, in June, I just presented the results publicly for the first time. And I'm so excited about the study because it really gets to the bottom of that question, because what we did was we gave the mediums read our mediums that we work with at the Windbridge Institute. Some of the readings they did were for living people and some were for deceased people, and they didn't know which were which. And then after each reading, they filled out this standardized questionnaire that we didn't develop. It's a standard psychological instrument and it quantitates 26 different levels dimensions of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So it puts a number on, like, how much were you feeling joy? How much were you feeling sadness? How much were you feeling, and so,
and that's really interesting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Under these blinded conditions, we found there was a statistically significant difference between the way they experienced information about the deceased versus about the living under blinded conditions. They didn't know which readings were which. Mm-hmm.
So the way the medium felt during the reception was different if the person was living versus the person was deceased.
That's correct. Mm-hmm. And that's novel. That's the first time that anyone has found that, has looked at that and gathered that data under those blinded conditions.
That's fascinating, because you also said that, you found that after working with different mediums, and what kind of mediums did you study? Were there male and female?
We have a team of Windbridge certified research mediums that we work with, and it's about 90% female, which is what we found.
Yeah, it's
when
general
we sort
in
of
the
put
public.
Out the cattle call, like, we're looking for mediums. It was about 90% female.
Yeah.
And I should say, first of all, that recruitment is closed. We have about 20, and that's a comfortable number for our research. So we have this team, and we're not certifying any new mediums, but they go through an 8-step process, and they're screened and trained and tested and interviewed, and the mediums that pass become Windbridge certified research mediums, and then they're part of the research team. So whenever we do a study, we have this
a group. Same way remote viewing was done by Stanford. They had a number of trained people who had studied the protocols of remote viewing, and somebody was a handler and somebody else was a viewer. And that makes a lot of sense, to be working with a stable of professionals so that you can, really start to examine what actually is going on for the medium. Most of the time people look at what's happening to the person getting the reading, or what's happening about the reading, what's the content.
Well, no one's looking at either one of those things. Like, both of those things are really important, but this is this topic has not been studied to the extent to which it should.
No, I agree with you. I've always felt myself that the phenomenology of this consciousness capacity was really what was missing. I mean, people looked at it, but not in the way you are. Look, we're going to take a little break, Dr. Beischel, and when we come back, I want to talk about some of the things you found in common with the various mediums. I mean, you talk about psychology, physiology, and you just do a beautiful job. You can follow up after the show or during our break at www.windbridge.org. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Jorge Aguilar. I'm the Southern Region Director for Food and Water Watch. You can find us at www.foodandwaterwatch.org, and you are listening to Dr. Zoh Hieronimus on 21st Century Radio.
Among Mediums, a Scientist's Quest for Answers. It's by the Windbridge Institute, and you can go to windbridge.org. So coming back then, Julie, to your desire to study, and I was glad to see you're on the adjunct faculty at Saybrook University, because Dr. Stanley Krippner has worked so hard for so long with mediums in South America. Mm-hmm. So when you've been working with these mediums, what are some of the common things that you've noticed about the mediums themselves?
The first distinction is the mediums that Dr. Krippner studies are spiritist mediums, mostly in Brazil, and our mediums are all American mediums, and they are sort of non-secular. It's not associated with a belief system. It's just a perception that they have,
right,
and they use. So that's one big difference there. And one of the things that we've looked at is the medium psychology, their personality type. So during the screening, we give them a barrage of psychology tests, and we don't use that. We don't use them to. It's not to screen people out, right, like, oh, you did not pass our psychology test. But we just want to collect that information from as many mediums as possible. Mm-hmm. So one of the tests that we give them is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, and it gives you 16 types there. It's based on Carl Jung's theories of personality, and it puts people in 16. They're one of 16 personality types, and none are worse than or better than any other one. So it's based on dichotomies, and you get these 4 letters. So it's like extroversion, introversion, thinking, feeling. So you get this 4-letter acronym, and that's your personality. And so intuition and sensing is one, and thinking and feeling are one. And so people who are both N and F, so intuitive and feeling, in the general population, it's about 16% of people in the country are N and F. And we found that mediums 85% are. Mm-hmm. And that's common. That's what other researchers have found with people who are good at psychic tests. And so what I really found interesting was if you look in the data that the Myers-Briggs test people publish, it shows which professions have the different personality types. And so the profession that has the highest percentage of people who are N and F are clergy at 55%, and then followed closely by art, music, and drama teachers at 54%. And the profession with the lowest percent of people who are both N and F are police and detectives. Mm-hmm. And so I think that that's really interesting, and that's probably why mediums and psychics and the police don't work together more than they do, because they just can't conceive of how the other one thinks.
Right, and yet that's one of the things that you're talking about is how important mediums can be in terms of solving crimes.
Potentially, yeah. When you want to gather as much information as you can when you're trying to solve a crime or find a missing person or a missing animal, and this may be a good way to get some new information. So I think a lot of research needs to be done, however, because resources are limited, right? The police can't chase every lead they have.
Right. So
they need to be able to determine which ones are worthy of being chased. And a lot of research needs to be done to determine, like, well, when they say a name, then maybe that's not one that's accurate all the time. But when they talk about, the environment, mm-hmm, maybe that's something we can trust, and that's something that you want to go, or, so we don't know what types of things are good, are reliable.
Well, and it's interesting because you note that, one of the things is how long does the crime scene itself impart information to a medium? Like, it's a lot different to get somebody there on the first day, or just to call them, even if they're half, the planet away. It doesn't really matter. A good medium can read from anywhere in the world, but some read because they have a telekinetic connection. They need to either see it or they need to touch something of the person that's in question. But have you done any study about these kinds of things, about like that question of how long does a crime scene impart information?
No, we actually, it's a research topic that I'm really interested in, but we haven't yet been able to investigate those questions because, we're independent research organization and we have limited staff and there's only so many studies that we can do. So that's something I'm really interested in, but it's not something that we have looked into just yet.
Right. But one of the things that Windbridge Institute talks about, and as you experienced for your own life and how this became a passion and a career of yours because of your mother's passing, is that how much this kind of mediumistic work helps people who are grieving.
Yeah, that is my main passion right now. That's my main focus of this research. And, our full name is the Windbridge Institute for Applied Research in Human Potential. So we're really just interested at the end of the day of the applications of these phenomena. How can they help people? So, that is really my main focus is mediumship readings as a potential treatment for the bereaved. And if you talk to some people, the anecdotal data is that it's almost night and day for some people. They are grieving for years and years and years even, and they have a reading and it's like everything changes. And if you talk to traditional, the traditional grief literature, traditional grief counselors, they'll tell you that's the focus of grief work is redefining the relationship. The person isn't gone, they're just not in the room anymore with you. They just don't have you have to redefine the relationship. So a mediumship reading is wonderful at that because it provides evidence that the person is still in your life. And that's all some people need. But like any treatment option, people are out in the world doing it, but we don't really know anything about it. We don't know as scientists who it's good for, when it's good, and all those kinds of things. So we need to gather that information. And I have a research paper coming out in the journal Omega, the Journal of Death and Dying, and it discusses the potential and what we still need to know. And we have recently begun crowdfunding for a study at the Windbridge Institute. It's called the BAM study, Bereavement and Mediumship, or BAM. And I thought that was a good acronym because that's how it can feel when someone dies, right? BAM, your life is never the same. So
it's so interesting because, Dr. Raymond Moody's work with communicating with the deceased, he started to notice that the Greeks had these psychomantiums, so he's obviously created one. And, you look at cultures around the world, except for Western industrial ones, and speaking with the deceased is very much a part of culture. And honoring the deceased. It's just that for some reason, in this dense materialistic age, somehow or other, there's only what you can touch, see, smell, taste exists. And yet we all know that's not true.
Right. And, we have to work within the rules, right, of our culture and our society and science. And so I've designed a clinical trial. My PhD is in pharmacology, so my training is in designing drug trials. And so I designed a drug trial, except it's not a drug, it's a mediumship reading.
It's fascinating.
And so it uses a standardized instrument for assessing grief, and that's the first step. We need to do that step to even say, is there or is there not an effect? We don't know. No one's ever looked at that before. And if there is, then there's a whole bunch of questions that come after that. Like I said, who's it good for? When is it good? What sorts of things, what kind of training can we provide to sitters before they get a reading so that they're well prepared? And I personally think that the best treatment is going to be mediumship reading plus counselor, because the medium has one job, and that is to provide the information that she's experiencing. But how you integrate that into your life once you walk away, that's a different story, and that may require a different professional. And so I think it's probably the combination of the two that we're going to be able to show at some point in the future after this first study gets done. But like I said, then a bunch of other questions need to be addressed. But I think this is really an really important topic.
It's a wonderful addition, to the whole literature in parapsychology, et cetera, altered states of consciousness. And one of the things I'm curious about from your own vantage point is you started out a different kind of scientist than what you're looking at now. And how has this work affected you and the way you see the world or the way people see you?
Well, science is just a tool, right? It's just one way of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can use science to look at anything. And so it didn't really change, that hasn't changed. Like, this didn't open up science for me or anything. Like, oh, wow, science can do this. Like, I knew science could do anything.
Right.
Science can look at anything. But, I try... I'm a scientist, so my training is remaining objective.
Mm-hmm.
While, I will say that unlike some other scientists who study these sorts of things, I don't design my studies based on my assumptions of how I think it should work or how I think it does work.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, these mediums are on our team, so we get a lot of feedback from them about what's possible. And if we did a protocol like this, is that something that you could do? And they would say, no, that's not really what we say we can do. And, that we don't have experience with that. And so we change it and and the only way you're going to learn anything about mediumship is you study it as it exists and as close to as it exists normally in reality as it can, and to hold it into these crazy standards that skeptical researchers
right. You need to be
them,
accurate 100%, if not that 200%.
Yeah, right.
Unlike
or
anything
fraud.
else material. No, it's very interesting. You're absolutely right, Dr. Beischel, is that they create standards for the parapsychology that they don't even create for the mundane realities. It's so interesting. So when you look at all these various readings that your mediums have done for the living or of the deceased, do you find that there's a common kind of happenstance between what the deceased is saying to the living? Because in my experience, most of the time it's to share love, compassion, appreciation, forgiveness. I've rarely ever heard anybody from the other side give me a message to somebody else that was in some way, inflammatory or destructive or unkind.
Well, I think in my experience, there seems to be 3 types of information that the mediums report, and it's information identifying of the discarnate. So, brown hair, and this was my job, and this was my personality. It's so that you can
know who it is, right?
Yeah.
That this is Uncle John, right?
Right. And then 2, information about the sitter's life since the person died. So evidence that they're still around.
Mm-hmm.
And then 3 are messages like I love you and that sort of thing. But I've never heard anything disparaging, but I have heard messages where I think that was the very first thing I learned in doing this research was when we die, we do not become immediately self-actualized. You're still you.
Too
you
bad.
You just don't have a body. So if we had one reading and the message to the sitter was like, why isn't my headstone installed yet? Like she was sort of complaining. So people still have their own
content.
Yeah, they have their own beliefs and their own opinions, and there's a story that I've told before, and I did a research reading with one of the mediums, and afterward she said, "Can you call me back off the record, and I need to tell you something else?" And so I said, "Sure," and we did our reading, and then I called her back, and I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "Your mom showed up today, and she just keeps showing me your name, like Dr. Julie Beischel. Like, it's just one thing and you can't change it." And she goes, "You aren't thinking about changing her name or anything, were you?" And I said, "Well, you don't know this, but actually, my husband and I were talking about getting married at the time, and we were trying to I had published already, so we're trying to figure out, do I want to change my name? Do we want to change it to some third name that's neither of ours?" And all this stuff. And the medium didn't know that. Right. And, she's saying, "Well, your mom doesn't think that you should do that." And that's all well and good. And I didn't change my name, but not because my mom told me to, right? She's still just my mom. It's still just her opinion. And so I would caution people that the dead are not all-knowing, and they don't have all the information, and you should take what they say with a grain of salt, because they're still just people.
Mm-hmm. That's true. But I also find that there's a gentleness, at least I'm only speaking from my experience of readings that were done voluntarily or involuntarily, is there seems to be sort of a kindness about even the mistakes they made or that the living have made, but they don't necessarily, make it seem like it's not anything. It's just that it's not primary. It's just an event. I find that it gets reduced to these are just events.
Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't call this out, but in that study that we did where the mediums read some living targets and some deceased targets, and then they took the test, and there were differences. The main difference between experiences after readings for the deceased were that there was way more love.
Yeah.
The dimension of love
yeah.
was significantly higher in readings that the medium did for deceased people than for living people. And
Mm-hmm.
and I've interviewed them about the differences, and that's something that comes up, is that they feel when they do a reading for a deceased person, they feel connected to the universe and to everyone, and it's a loving feeling, and they're empowered by it, and they're
Mm-hmm.
energized by it. And when they do a reading for the living, it's one said, I feel alone, like
Mm-hmm.
she doesn't feel connected when she does a reading for the
Mm-hmm.
living, because it's just gathering information. It's not a communication. It's not a collaboration.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because when you do readings for animals, there's none of the psychological traps that go on in readings for humans. They just tell you exactly what it is. It's very straightforward. And when you have look at all the sort of scale, we have to take a break. But when we come back, I want to talk about the things that interest you the most, because, there are 1,000 different research studies you could create.
Oh, yeah, there are.
Exactly. And so honing in on what will be the most productive in the sense of, generalizing or normalizing, I guess is what I'd hope for, that this is something that's really a gift. It's not something to be afraid of, but our culture and the church and others have made it seem, such a foreign thing that you should never, ever talk to the deceased. We'll be right back. Dr. Julie Beischel is our guest. Among Mediums, A Scientist's Quest for Answers is her ebook. You can go to her website, www.windbridge.org.
Hello, this is Dr. Daniel Fohr, author of Ancestral Medicine, Rituals for Personal and Family Healing. You can learn more about me and my work at ancestralmedicine.org. You're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zoh Hieronimus.
We're currently joined by Dr. Julie Beischel. Her ebook, I encourage you to read it, Among Mediums, A Scientist's Quest for Answers, and it's by the Windbridge Institute, a 2013 release. You can go to www.windbridge.org. And, Julie, when you looked at all of this, and as a scientist looking at it without any prejudice and without any expectation, is there anything that has surprised you as you've proceeded in this direction?
I think that the dead are not all-knowing. I think that was pretty surprising to me, that they still are just people. And I think it's really interesting that it seems that the process, that you continue learning and growing too, that you don't just stop, right? You continue to be a better person, and attempt, to learn things. I was excited to know that there was still learning. I'm a big fan of learning. Even on the other side.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. I mean, when you start to do the clinical research that discusses what the ancient teachings have always maintained, that Earth is a classroom, and then we leave the Earth, but we don't really leave it. We just sort of go out of our bodies, but we're still part of the Earth conversation and the work. And it's just a little more difficult, from what I understand, because you can't necessarily push matter around. So there are many teachings that tell you whatever you think to do while you're living, do it, because when you don't have a physical body, you have to work through other living beings and motivate them to carry out your vision or your will, mm-hmm. or your understanding. So there's a lot of collaboration that goes on, and I think Hollywood has done such a disservice to our sense of relationship in timelessness, because they've made it all seem so scary that everything's a haunting and it's all devilish.
Yeah.
And the truth is, it's not.
That was the next thing I was going to say. That I was surprised to learn was the dead people are not scary.
Right.
You're right, because everything that you've ever heard about the dead is that they're out to get you and they can hurt you. And no, they're just people. Yeah, there are bad people. There are
mm-hmm.
bad living people in the world too. So it's, but they're just people. Yeah.
Well, and as I tell people,
I love that what you do, and I'm so fascinated when current modern research conclusions mimic what ancient wisdom said. I love when those two things come together.
Yeah, I do too, but I think that's kind of the time period we're in, because quantum physics has helped do that, and the kind of work you're doing and others that are focused on consciousness. And, one of the very interesting things, though, is that it is collaborative. And I think that's the beauty of what you're doing, is that we don't lose anybody, just like nothing is ever fully gone. It's just turned into another form. So it's a question of appreciating our various dimensions of being. And that's why I was so intrigued with what you're doing.
And I think before the break you had asked about the normalization of this phenomena. And I think that that's really important, because I've heard so many horror stories about young children diagnosed with schizophrenia, which is a disease that doesn't happen until your late 20s usually, and because they don't know what else to, it's physicians and clinicians who aren't familiar with mediumship, and if someone says they're hearing voices, then they immediately assume that that's a pathological state. But we need to be educating people about this, so that if that's troubling to those children, that they can learn how to harness it and how to control it and how to provide boundaries, so that they're not just being bombarded. And, we need to learn more about this so that we can provide what people need when these things are happening to them, and that we don't just drug them or institutionalize them. Like, we need to be helping people. So I think that's really important. And one of the studies that we're currently doing is we're doing a hematology study. So we're taking blood from mediums, the brave mediums on our team, who let me stick them with a needle multiple times, before and after a reading to see what happens physiologically to the body. Because a lot of mediums, a lot of psychics have health problems. And so that's something else we need to learn more about, so we can help the practitioners who, if this is having if this is sapping certain cofactors out of the body, then we need to be replacing them. And, we don't know anything about that. So that's, again, a lot of the studies we do are the first step, and then a lot more needs to get done after that. But we need to address these very first steps before we can get any further. And like I said, this BAM study is the first step in addressing the potential therapeutic benefit of mediumship readings for the bereaved. I'm really excited about that study. If people are interested in that, they can go to afterlifescience.com to learn more about the BAM study. But I think that's my main focus now. I think that's going to be really important. We're empiricists. We collect data, and at the end of the day, it matters less to us how the things work than how they can help people. And with my background in pharmacology, there are so many drugs on the market that we don't really know how they work. You can look it up. You can look up mechanism of certain drugs, unknown mechanism, but they still sell them and people still use them. And, we don't know how a lot of things work in the world, but we're familiar with them, and they're part of our life. And I'm looking forward to a time when that's how mediumship readings are viewed as maybe we can't ever explain it, but it's helping people, and it's something that happens, and it's a talent, it's a perception people have, and no more than that.
And one of the things I've noticed, and I think you commented in your ebook, is some of the mediums have migraines. Many mediums I've noticed over the years are overweight if they do it professionally all of the time. And I remember one medium telling me that was just sort of this battery that they bring in so much energy, and they don't necessarily know how to let it go.
Right. So if we could teach people and that they could do what they do while being able to keep their body healthy, that would be beneficial to everyone. Yeah, one of the things that I noticed was a really high prevalence of autoimmune disorders. And my theory, I have no evidence to support this, but my theory is that because they are sort of taking in so many foreign people all day long, that maybe the body gets confused about what's self and what isn't. And that's why this predilection for autoimmune disorders. We don't know, because we're at the very beginning of studying any of this stuff. So.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And that's interesting relative to just intuitives in general, or highly sensitive people, how oftentimes highly sensitive people might have these capacities of perception, but they're so overwhelmed by societal noise or light or the fluorescent lights in the grocery store. I mean, real things that affect so many people that nobody's really taking into account in terms of the lighting that's being used in schools, which makes children hyperactive or bored or sleepy or anyway. So when you come then to look at what you're doing, what interests you that maybe you can't do right now but you'd like to do?
Oh, I would love to do a neuroimaging study, but those are so expensive. So a study like a functional MRI study of what's happening in real time in the medium's brain. That I think that would get us, very far in understanding a lot of how these things work, and
or not. It may completely interfere with the capacity because of its own energetic form.
That's true, because I have heard that too. And that would be an interesting finding as well. Like a lot of things, whatever we find will be something new and will be something interesting. So that I'm excited to do that.
And what about, the TV program, which I've watched a number of times and I've really liked it, Psychic Kids, where they help children, just like you're saying, who have these abilities, they can't control them, they're natural, and then they need to be trained by a more developed practitioner. But what about children who have these skills, which presumably is more prevalent now than, let's say, 20 years ago?
Well, I am not a clinician, so I don't have expertise in that. I can't speak to that, but I know that it is an important topic and that children are being misdiagnosed, and
I agree with you.
Dangerous. I know that. That's as much as I can say, though. I think.
And you're also, though, looking at Wimbridge Institute at investigating technologies that might be useful in enhancing, as you say, quote, interaction and communication, like electronic voice phenomena and others. Yeah,
my expertise, my specialty is the study of mediums, but my husband, Mark, my partner, we co-founded the Wimbridge Institute together. That's his forte. He does the instrumental transcommunication research, and so you'll have to have him on, and he can talk to you about
Fascinating.
that.
And when you're now having an opportunity, the Institute, what is it? Is it 10 years old? 5 years old. So it's really young, but already you're really sort of starting something new, kicking up the dust, as they would say. And how have other professionals in general responded to this kind of work?
We got a lot of experts who agreed to be on our scientific advisory board right away, and that was really encouraging, that people were thinking, we've met you, we know what you're capable of, we think you starting this institute is important, and they will be part of it. And so that was really encouraging. And more often than not, I am meeting people who from all different kinds of fields who recognize that this is important, and that science doesn't have boundaries, and that if we don't know everything about something, we should continue to investigate it. But I think that I'm running into those people more, because the people who just dismiss all of this outright, they don't show up to conferences that I'm at anyway. So I don't encounter those people, and I'm not interested in what they have to say.
No,
anyway.
Well, it's very fortunate now. When I think back 30, 40 years ago, when all of this work was sort of being discussed, but it wasn't really formalized, and here we are now, at the turn of the century into the first decade or so, and to see that it's possible is just very heartening. And again, I don't even remember what website I was on that connected me to Wimbridge, but I love the name, the Windbridge. Why did you choose that name?
We wanted a name that had like a very immaterial and a very material component, and so the sort of the yin and the yang, and the wind, like spirit, you can't hold it or see it or measure it, or you can measure it, but hold it, but it's very powerful.
I thought it was lovely.
And then bridge would be the bridge between this world and the next. So, and the URL was available, right? That's how you always have to name things these days, right?
That's it ultimately these days. No, it's a beautiful title. Look, we have about a minute and a half left. Is there anything you'd like to share we've not touched on?
Well, my husband and I are writing a book called Psychic Intimacy, and it's a handbook for couples about how you can use our non-local connections. So I would invite people to join our email list to keep up to date on that. And, as we publish things and talk at different conferences and that sort of thing, they can sign up on our email list at winbridge.org.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love that. Because, once you start practicing, of course, you can communicate across great distances with the living in your family. And, of course, this is what people have talked about for centuries of knowing when somebody's in harm's way, even though they're
Right.
thousands of miles away. But by the same token, if your children are traveling and you want to protect them, you can send them loving thoughts. Anything else along those lines?
I mean, our purpose is for this handbook is to establish intimacy, because we're so, like, though we're so connected electronically, I think we get separated. And so to be even in the same room and, think, I'm thinking of this
Right.
image, and then having the other person be able to know it too, like, that establishes intimacy in a relationship.
Mm-hmm. No, it's great. It's just wonderful. Well, I think the work you all are doing, like Dr. Dean Radin said, I just think it's beautiful what you're doing, and it's such a great contribution to the world of science and the world of consciousness. I like what Dean said, who's been my guest. This research that takes place at the Windbridge Institute has been judged by international peers to be important and reflects the Institute's commitment to conducting world-class science. Congratulations, Dr. Beischel.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. Again, Among Mediums, A Scientist's Quest for Answers. It's an ebook. Go to www.windbridge.org. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner, and I'm Dr. Zoh Hieronimus. And remember, we do need more love in the world.